Some of you, I see, were here a few weeks ago when Craig Holdridge spoke to us about genetically modified crops. Future events include a talk by Andrew Kimbrell, the director of the Institute for Technology Assessment, on April 27th, and that'll be a lunchtime event. And then on April 29th, we're going to have a panel called Living with the Genie. And on that will be Ray Kurzweil, Howard Rheingold, Denise Caruso, Richard Rhodes, and Mark Shapiro. And that'll be in the evening at Pimentel, probably at around 6:30. I hope you can join us there. There's a sign-up sheet going around, and if you haven't been to a night event or signed up before, if you put your name and email on there, we'll make sure that you get notices of these events and things in the future. But anyway, thank you very much for coming. So, emerging technologies. What our guest is here to talk about, and how to think about them, how to regulate them. You know, sometimes I feel like we're on a beach, waiting, expectantly, apprehensively, for a series of waves we know are out there and coming our way. Waves with names like nanotechnology, various biotechnologies that promise genetic enhancements, genetically engineered animals as well as plants, artificial intelligence, stem cell repair of the human genome. All these technologies, and I'm sure we can, and people in the room could list others, hold out great promise and probably perils. Some we can imagine and others we can't. But of course that metaphor of a wave is full of assumptions. And they're dubious assumptions. It assumes that these, or it depicts these developments as natural, as inevitable, as beyond anyone's control. There's not much you can do to stop a wave. And this, of course, is pretty much how we've greeted new technologies over the last century. One more product in the free marketplace of ideas, benign until proven dangerous, left to private enterprise until public harm is impossible to ignore. This approach, as we all know well, hasn't served us very well. History shows that we've made some serious mistakes in our handling of new technologies over the years. These are reflected in the rising rates of certain cancers, in habitat destruction, in global warming, in the depletion of the ozone layer. In many cases, we've waited to act to limit these technologies until the damage has been done. And the damage is sometimes irreversible. Our environmentalism has largely been an after-the-fact cleanup job. But as we stand here on this beach, looking at these new waves, are there better ways to think about the waves now heading toward us? As soon as this is what always happens. I should have waited longer. Carolyn Raffensperger, our guest, has been thinking harder and more provocatively on that question than anyone I know of. Carolyn is an environmentalist and a lawyer and a scientist. She's the founder and executive director of the Science and Environmental Health Network, a think tank dedicated to public interest science. She's trained as an archaeologist. She then went to law school and worked for several years for the Sierra Club. Over the last few years, she's focused a lot of her efforts on promoting the precautionary principle. And in fact, that's where I met her. She was so busy promoting the precautionary principle that she tracked me down and persuaded me I should write about it for the New York Times, which I did. And that's when I learned she's an indefatigable promoter of her own ideas. The precautionary principle, as you'll learn a lot about today, is itself a seemingly very benign idea with revolutionary implications, I think, for the relationship of science and technology on the one side and society on the other, and revolutionary in its implications, I think, for environmentalism. Carolyn is asking the important questions. What is the place of ethics in science? Who should get to decide whether or not society adopts a new technology and on what basis? Should it fall to the public to prove the hazards of a new technology, or should the burden be on its promoters to prove its safety? What role should scientific uncertainty and ignorance play in the management of technologies? Who should control the power of technology and to what end? I think you'll find that our guest this afternoon offers some very arresting answers to these questions. So please welcome Carolyn Raffensperger. to Berkeley.
Oh, the microphone. Yes, the old microphone trick. Let's point it up. Okay. I was thinking about dinner I had with Barry Lopez. How many of you know Barry Lopez's writing? He's from Oregon, and he's written some of the most beautiful natural history books that I've ever encountered. And I was assigned to entertain Barry Lopez at one of those cocktail dinners that many of you who've gone visiting and speaking have been subjected to. And, we're drinking quietly. The conversation is drifting, the way that conversations do. And then he said something that snapped my head to attention. He said, this experiment in government has failed. Whoa, I didn't even know it was an experiment. I thought it was set in concrete and we were never experimenting again. And I thought, what could he possibly mean? He went on to say that what we've done is created a fourth branch of government for which there are no checks and balances. He said that essentially we have created corporations as a fourth branch of government, and there are no institutional ways for balancing corporations with the other three branches. So what do we do about it? Now, whether you agree with Barry Lopez or not, it's a really interesting question. And as I've thought about how we would decide, just let's assume that it is an experiment, how would we know whether this particular constitutional form of government has succeeded or not? What I'd like to do is offer this talk as a way of both trying to answer that question only from the environmental and public health perspective, and then coming up with some answers. And there are two other little anecdotes that I want to offer before I go into my PowerPoint presentation. That is that David Brooks wrote about the Iowa caucuses, and I had an opportunity to participate in the Iowa caucus, and it was one of the most exciting experiences in democracy I've ever had. I interviewed all of those candidates, when they came to Iowa day after day, and had the same experience that David Brooks had when he wrote for the New York Times on January 20th. And he said that he discovered that Democrats didn't hate Washingtonians. We discovered that 9/11 wasn't really weighing in on the caucuses, and it wasn't part of that presidential conversation in the Midwest. And he said the most interesting thing. He said that those Iowans, those Midwesterners, were really looking for a grand idealism, a big idealism. They were hungry for it. And in response, all of those candidates gave smallish policies, smallish ideas. Where are we going to get those big ideas? So if government has failed, at least in the environment and public health, we'll hold that as a hypothesis. You can answer that for yourself. And if we're looking for those big ideas, where are we going to get them? Where are we going to get the big ideas that can help us try some new experiments? And the last anecdote was a friend of mine who got in the elevator with Doris Lessing. And this woman was having her own personal difficulties, and the author was there and standing there. They were both facing the numbers in the door. And my friend said, "So what do you do when you're facing really difficult times?" Now, she was asking a writer. And this wonderful writer, Doris Lessing, said, "You get into situations where you improvise." So that's my answer. We are in a place and in a time where we can improvise. Those of you in California are freer to improvise than almost anybody else in the country. So it's really a privilege to get to give this talk when I want to offer the possibility that government has not been successful as an experiment for protecting public health and the environment, that the public is looking for big ideas, and we have a chance to experiment and improvise at this time with them. Let's see if this is going to work. Signal. There we go. I came up with this title, and I didn't see the title on the poster, so we're going to play and we're going to improvise even here. I'm going to talk about 3 ideas. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this particular roadmap, but just to let you know, and then a lot of words here. Here's the general theme. I want to talk about the key role of government. I want to talk about how that government might carry out that role. I want to talk about public interest research and how we're developing new technologies within that context. And then I want to go back to this idea about the precautionary principle folded into that entire meet. We're going to braid together all those ideas today. So here are Jane Lubchenco's questions. Remember, this is in the context of whether government has succeeded or failed. How's our world changing? What are the implications of these changes for society? What's the role of science in meeting the challenges created by a changing world? And how should scientists respond to these challenges? And I would invite all of us, whether we're scientists or not, to think about how we respond. Here, how do lawyers respond? How do government officials respond? How do journalists respond to a changing world and a world that is in trouble? And then one more question. What does technology have to do with environmental and public health problems? So why the precautionary principle? Why are we going to talk about this idea? Why do I think we need some new improvisation and experiments? First is that we've caused major global change. And I could give an entire list of those. You don't need that. You've got some of them here, which you can read as well as I can. And you know this, you hear that every night in the news, and every environmentalist that ever talks gives you this same list. But I would submit to you that the magnitude of human-caused change is unprecedented. I want to also suggest that the world is complex, it's interconnected, and it's dynamic, and that we have difficulties in science assessing cumulative systems the systems level and interactive effects. Surprises are frequent. They're not rare. Surprises are the rule. In a field called adaptive management, they say surprises are the rule in complex systems. We also have future generations, and predicting outcomes and events into the future and imagining the impact on those generations are difficult. We know that economists think about this a lot with things like discounting. How are scientists thinking about it, and how are government policies addressing it? And then many of our choices have high decision stakes. And by that I mean they have big consequences. So there are things that we decide that actually make a big difference both on a scale and in time. We also know that the patterns of illness and disease are changing. And here I want to say that the common answer to an environmentalist like me is, what are you guys whining about? The world is actually getting better, and here's the evidence. You're living longer. You know, I've got a grandmother alive at 98. Two of my grandparents died at the age of 95 or 96. So what are you complaining about? Infant mortality until 2002 was actually declining in the United States. 2003, it started to go back up in the United States, a bad pattern. But for the most part, you know, people are living longer. You're not dying of cancer. You might get more cancer, but we're not dying of it. So they would suggest that those old patterns suggest that the world is fine, that we're doing quite well, thank you very much. That misses that the patterns are actually changing. That what we're seeing is increases in certain kinds of diseases, and you know some of these. We know that asthma is increasing. We know that neurodevelopmental disorders are increasing. The incidence of some malignancies, especially adjusted for age, are increasing. We know that certain birth defects, and some of them are rather startling, by the way, in terms of birth defects. If you think about deformities of the penis, they're increasing. And if you want some good information on that, go look at New Jersey statistics. If you want information on neurodevelopmental disorders, look at California's data. And you can go and tease apart the information on the increase in autism in California. Lots of ideas about it, lots of questions about whether it's a matter of statistics or new ways of diagnosing that spectrum. Lots of ways of thinking about it. But when you look at the statistics, what we see is some of those patterns are changing. We have someone from the Department of Health Services, and I'm sure, Tom, you could address some of that if you wanted to. But those are the kinds of things that we're seeing, that the world is changing, those patterns are changing. We're seeing a decline and an unraveling of some of the basic systems on Earth. So what is this idea called the precautionary principle? Here's one definition. It says when an activity raises threats of harm to human health or the environment, precautionary measures should be taken, even if some cause and effect relationships are not fully established scientifically. So how do we do that? That is an incredibly abstract idea, isn't it? Take precautionary action in the face of uncertainty? Okay. So here's how we do it. one of the things we can do is decide what kind of world we want to live in. When we're talking about technology, is that wave just going to roll at us? Or can we decide what kind of world we want to live in? Can we set goals? You know, just the patterns of asthma in San Francisco, or both county and the city. Could we say we have a baseline for the asthmas that are occurring, the number of asthmas? Could we set a goal for decreasing those? Could we set a goal of decreasing the number of children in special education, not through changing diagnostics or just moving them all into regular classrooms, but reducing the number of children which have developmental disabilities and learning disabilities? Could we set goals for the kind of world we want to live in? Shifting the burden of proof. This is often controversial, and I'll get to what that actually means. It's an idea that comes out of the judiciary, and now looking at what that means in regulatory agencies and elsewhere. We can examine a full range of alternatives and select the least harmful. California, you've got a law that requires you to do environmental impact statements, and as part of that, you get to look at alternatives. So all of these ideas have some basis in law. Just going back to goal setting, the Federal Department of Health and Human Services sets health goals. Why can't we set environmental health goals and begin to set the kind of direction that we want to take and that we can define as progress? And then finally, in the face of scientific uncertainty, we require democratic decision-making. It means that we can't leave it to just the experts. Now, the interesting thing about the precautionary principle, and I didn't discover this, somebody who heard about the precautionary principle, who was working at the National Cancer Institute, said to me, this is the first decision rule I ever heard that incorporates both epistemology and ethics. And I have to say, for an environmentalist, it made my blood pressure go up, because I could just imagine beginning to talk about ethics when we have not been given the tools or the language or the skills or even the permission to talk about ethics. You know the rule as well as I do. Sound science. You are only allowed to use sound science. Almost anything except cloning, right? And then we're going to move into ethics, and we're going to have a bioethics commission. But for environmental decisions, whether it's factory hog farms, whether it is nanotechnology, regardless of what it is, we are told that the decision will be made on sound science. But the precautionary principle completely changes the terms of that debate, because it brings together both ethics and the branch of science that talks about how we know and what we know. So what's the ethic and the value? By the way, John Ralston Saul just wrote an incredibly interesting article in Harper's Magazine on globalization. And he defines ethics as the measurement of the public good. Now, what a different idea than who's sleeping with whom, which is what we've devalued the idea of ethics to, right? We've got a sexual morality, and we've got this kind of personal idea, rather than the measurement of the public good. And that's what the precautionary principle is about. It's about the public good. And so what is it? It's do no harm. And then, of course, you know the stuff about science. What do we know? How do we know it? And what don't we know? You know, the values underlying the precautionary principle, I just listed a couple here. Respect for the needs and rights of this and future generations. Humility toward the natural world and our ability to understand it through science. Democracy. That people should have a voice in the things that affect their lives. And responsibility. Something that my generation, and I understand Berkeley, pioneered some of the not taking responsibility in the 60s. Now, that's what my parents told me when they said I couldn't come to Berkeley. And that was, so the idea of responsibility is that government has a responsibility. And what is that? You know, we've got a lot of ideas about what the responsibility and the role of government is, don't we? National security is the one that's come to the top. We've got some other ideas about government. It is to promote global economic competitiveness. We've got a lot of ideas of government. But I would submit to you that the new idea, that a central organizing idea about a role of government is that its responsibility is to manage the commons or the commonwealth for this and future generations. It's a responsibility. And that industry and other individuals have an obligation to take responsibility for their actions in the world. And that's what I mean by shifting the burden of proof. That they take responsibility for their actions in the world. We'll get to whether it means proving safety or not. So what is this idea of the precautionary principle? Very simple. There are 3 core ideas. All definitions of the precautionary principle contain these 3 elements: the threat of harm, lack of scientific certainty, and action to prevent harm. So harm, uncertainty, action. That's all you have to remember, and you'll get pretty far. Harm, to whom or what, magnitude and kind. We talk about it mostly in terms of the environment. There are some new treaties that talk about public health. And interestingly enough, the International Society for Ethnobiology incorporated the precautionary principle into their code of ethics to guide bioprospecting. So when you go to the Amazon to look for new medical cures, scientists have an ethical obligation to honor the precautionary principle and prevent harm to those cultures and to society. Now, when we talk about magnitude and kind of harm, the treaties usually have a modifier that says, is it serious? Is it they don't talk much about cumulative, but it's one that we look at, and now as part of California EPA's environmental justice mandate to use the precautionary principle, looking at cumulative impacts. Is it irreversible? Can we think about actions in the world that are reversible? But when they're irreversible, we better watch out. And then, is it easily avoidable? I often think about harm, when your kid is going to fall down and scrape her knee, it's trivial harm. She's going to heal. But if it's easily avoidable and you can pick her up before she falls, why not? Scientific uncertainty comes in lots of different flavors. It's a lot like ice cream. So we can have uncertainty about cause or magnitude, which we talked about earlier. And we can talk about uncertainty and whether just a little more data is going to help us out of the mess. We can talk about the indeterminacy of complex systems, that understanding global climate change requires that we understand the drivers of the ocean and ocean currents, and it's much more complex than simple data input and outputs. And then have we asked the right question? And how much of the environmental work and how much of the work on emerging technologies has really been asking the wrong questions? And I want to come back to that in a minute. And then precautionary action. Can we anticipate and prevent harm? Can we use our science to begin looking at the kinds of harm and anticipate some of that, use it for prediction? Can we increase rather than decreasing options by whatever actions we take? Can we take actions that can be monitored and reversed? Can we increase the resilience, health, and integrity of the whole system? And one of the things they say about the environmentalists is, well, we're going to do that and we're going to lose jobs. Or, if we're going to have the jobs, then we're going to, we're going to get rid of this endangered species. Why do we have to do that? Why don't we use some of the definitions coming out of sustainable agriculture that you really need a 3-part definition for sustainability? You need economic viability, you need social justice, and you need ecological soundness. So we need that whole picture together when we're considering a precautionary action. And then here's one problem with the environmental movement. We usually think one answer is going to, one size is going to fit all. So, okay, we don't like your cleaners. Let's all switch to vinegar and salt or baking soda. Well, have you ever thought about what that much vinegar is going to do to your water system? If we're going to acidify the whole world in that way. One size does not fit all. We really need quite a bit of diversity. I want to offer to you 2 laws of technology as we think about the precautionary principle. The first, and this ties in, by the way, to the diversity issue, when we look at multiple solutions rather than one. The bigger the technological solution, the greater the chance of extensive unforeseen side effects. And this is Stephen Schneider's work in 1976. So scale matters. And I have to say, my car is not causing a problem. But my car, plus Mark Dowie's car, plus Michael Pollan's car, plus Tom Kelly's car, are causing problems. Scale matters. The other thing we know is that the greater the rapidity of human-induced changes, the more likely we are to destabilize complex systems of nature. If you look at biotechnology, we put those biotech crops into place, especially in the Midwest, very quickly. Very difficult to reverse, very difficult to actually run any kinds of experiments and monitor for harm. And so it's much more likely to destabilize these complex systems when we rapidly introduce something. So what kinds of responses can we have to this? The first is that so much of the work that we're doing evaluating complex technologies usually uses one discipline. This is incredibly lousy epistemology. We need to use multiple disciplines. We don't just need toxicology or just epidemiology. So for instance, looking at endocrine disruptors, we know that a lot of these chemicals are not just acting like poisons. They're not just going to kill you or give you cancer in however long. They're actually acting physiologically and pharmacologically. Some of these are acting more like drugs than they are actually acting like poisons. So why aren't we bringing in people who understand physiology and pharmacology into these debates? Looking at nanotechnology. You know, the people who are working on nanotechnology and moving it wholesale into the environment. And if you doubt my words, go and look up cosmetics and nanotechnology. Go look up the contracts that major clothing industries have with nanotech coatings for clothes and look at how widespread it already is. If you want to go and look at L'Oreal's hand cream, introducing nanotech particles into it. Those folks have not been having conversations with people who understand the environmental health consequences of small things. We have a really good idea that small things and living systems don't necessarily get along at certain points of time. We know that blood-brain barriers, we know that placentas and other things, lungs, don't necessarily screen out very small particles. What are we going to do about that? What kinds of disciplines are we going to bring in to begin evaluating that? We need many more disciplines at the table. The other is we need biological principles, not isolated, limited facts. We were having a conversation over coffee today, and so you want to know what the harm is, and you want to know where the decimal point is. Well, let me submit to you that the use of the decimal point and risk assessment has been designed to bore you. And for you journalists, it's designed to get you off the track of the right question. Trust me on this. And as soon as you have bored your public with exactly where the decimal point is, you've missed the real point. What we need to do is go back to biological principles. So what we know in California from California EPA's information is brominated flame retardants are accumulating now in human breast milk. So what's the harm? Well, we're going to keep using brominated flame retardants, just wait until we find out what the harm is? Or are we going to use the biological principle that bioaccumulation is a problem? It's a biological idea that those long branching hydrocarbon chains accumulating in human tissue will cause trouble, although we might not know exactly what or how much or when. When do we start to act on those biological principles? Ignacio, welcome. I didn't see you. So I want to talk about how we understand causation, because that's usually the big fight, right? Well, this causes that. We came up with some really interesting, it's been an interesting question for some time in epidemiology. And this is the Hill criteria for causation in epidemiology. I'm not going to run through these, but I want you to notice that there are 6. And for those of you who can read, you don't need me to read it for you. But this has been often the set of questions that you need in place to prove causation in epidemiology. What I want to show you is how these came to play, those 6 criteria around cigarettes and lung cancer. And by the way, I'm only talking about lung cancer. I'm not talking about bladder cancer. We have a huge amount of information on bladder cancer and cigarettes. In 1945, we saw that incidence rises together. 1950, we saw that it's through a case control. We had more information through a case control study. 1953, we knew that tar causes cancer in mice. 1954, we had follow-up studies showing association, showing that the association of greater exposure and greater risk equated with greater risk. We had all of that information between 1945 and 1954. In the early 1980s, you had all of those tobacco companies sitting in front of Congress saying, I swear that I do not personally believe that tobacco causes lung cancer. Do you know why? We were missing one Hill criteria. We didn't understand the biological mechanism. And so even with all of that information, between 1945 and 1954, they could say with a straight face that that tobacco didn't cause cancer. Now, at what point did we have enough information to start taking public health action? At what point? And that's the kind of debate we're having now with the precautionary principle. Can't prove harm. Well, what is it? Is it that we're missing one of the Hill criteria? Is it that we're missing two? At what point do we take action? Now, I want to say that the Department of Health Services in California has done some incredibly innovative things around how we learn, how we take information in, using an approach, a qualitative Bayesian approach, which says, are we educable as a regulatory agency and as scientists? And so they looked at electromagnetic fields, and Tom can talk more about that, but if you want to look at a great study on uncertainty that addresses this particular problem, what do we know about EMFs? And what don't we know? And what kind of action would we take in the face of that uncertainty? It's a brilliant study, and you all are doing tremendous work. Now, I want to address shifting the burden of proof because this is so contentious, and it's been contentious here in California. Industry has an obligation to test their product. Right now, we're having a huge debate over chemicals. How many years have we been arguing about chemicals? You know, when was Rachel Carson's Silent Spring? 1962, right? 1962, Silent Spring was published. And we now are putting into commerce 3,000 to 4,000 chemicals a year. We still can't get testing. Europe is now promoting a new approach called the REACH program, the Register Evaluation, I can't remember the whole entire acronym, but the simple shorthand for that is don't test, no market. If you have not tested your chemical for the basics of neurotoxicity, reproductive toxicity, etc., you can't sell your chemical in Europe. Well, what a great idea. So simply to have the responsibility to test your product, to ask the right questions and use the right scientific disciplines, you're not getting away with asking the wrong questions. You need to heed early warnings. So even before all the Hill criteria are in place, when we've got some information that we can start taking action earlier enough, they have an obligation to seek safer alternatives, to publicly disclose information about harm, right to know, and pay for damage and restoration. It's a central idea of pollute or pay. It's an old idea in environmental law. Shifting the burden of proof does not mean that they have to prove absolute safety. It is not possible. I cannot prove that my exhalation of carbon dioxide is safe. I can't do it. Right now we know that it's adding to global climate change. I can't prove that it's safe. We cannot ask that kind of question. But we can ask industry to do some other things. We can ask them to test, we can ask them to disclose, we can ask them to pay. And I have to say that shifting the burden of proof does mean that the environment, that your children, that those otters, that those baby seals and the pelicans get the benefit of the doubt. I wanted to say, in the words of Ben Franklin, it's easy to see and hard to foresee. The reason I wanted to talk about Ben Franklin is he was inventing institutions right and left. So he saw a need, and so there's the fire department. He sees a need and invents the library. And so we can do that. We can invent these kinds of things. And we want to take this, this idea that it's easy to see but hard to foresee. Are we smart enough to foresee? Let's try. People used to think that the precautionary principle only meant bans. So we're just going to ban everything. And then most people say to me, you environmentalists want us all to go back to the Amish horse and buggy. Well, baloney. If we only employ the precautionary principle after we've done our risk assessment, after we've argued about the location of the decimal point, after we've gotten all the Hill criteria, and then we still figure out, oh, we're in trouble, then we're going to ban or sunset stuff. That's not very precautionary. It's kind of stupid. It's bad economics, isn't it? You know, you spend $30 million developing your genetically modified wheat, and then we go all the way through the whole system and then say, oh, sorry, can't do it. And we ban it or create a moratorium. It's just late. That's a post-market strategy. It's what environmental regulation has been dependent on. So what we need to do is build it in early. What we need to do is create a public interest research agenda and have pre-market testing. So one of the ways that we can employ the precautionary principle as a completely different way of approaching new technology in the world we live in. And here's what we need to do. We need to start at Berkeley with what you are looking at, what you are researching, and then we need to carry it all the way through to the courts, all the way through. And if you want to read my white paper on the courts, it's up on our website, and you can see how I think the courts can be part of the infrastructure for protecting public health and the environment. But we need to start not just with the ban and the moratorium, but all the way through to what we're researching. We've got lots of approaches to precaution in the United States. We've got a policy framework. San Francisco has adopted it to guide all of its environmental regulation and policies. We've creating systems to detect and respond to early warnings. And Verizon actually issued a warning in a pamphlet sent out to its cell phone users that identified the precautionary principle and talked about the uncertainties with EMFs, and then told parents, you've got alternatives. You know, you can use an earphone, and you don't have to have the headphone right up next to your kid's ear, and limit non-emergency uses. We've had certain jurisdictions identify and select alternatives to one or more harmful chemicals. The Los Angeles Unified School District adopted the precautionary principle to guide pesticides, and some institutions are using it to guide the research agenda. Bristol-Myers Squibb's research into drugs in water is really wonderful. And New York has just drafted legislation to guide emerging technologies. I want to just talk a little bit about the public trust doctrine. Mark Dowie's written a wonderful article that appeared in Orion magazine, and I understand you've been doing some speaking about it. He's writing a little bit about the history. I don't know if you're writing so much about it as a theory of government, but I would just propose that it's a really interesting and new way of looking at the role of government. It's part of 48 states, common law, and constitutions. And it provides a visionary role for government, and that is that it's the guardian, it's the manager of the Commonwealth for this and future generations. California, it's part of your law. And you've got quite a bit, if you look it up on Google, you have a whole statement about watercourses and the rights of the public to use watercourses for commerce, navigation, fisheries, and the preservation of ecological units. Pretty beautiful. Constitution of Hawaii has a long statement, and it's too many words this late in the afternoon. But what I'd like, so we're just going to skip over it, and if anybody wants my slides, I'm happy to give you that reference. But the interesting thing is that when Hawaii had a challenge to its constitutional provision, it required the use of the precautionary principle. And I think the public trust doctrine does three things. One is that it establishes a time frame for government for this and future generations. It's an argument against privatization. And it mandates the use of the precautionary principle. Notice they make it a plural, which is kind of interesting. So, when we're talking about protecting the commons and the Commonwealth, public interest research is one process or method for understanding, protecting, and adding to the Commonwealth. Public interest research aims at developing knowledge and or technology that increases the Commonwealth. It doesn't diminish it. I want to suggest that the commons and the tragedy of the commons was the lack of resource management. And you've heard a lot about that. And that one of the favored solutions to the commons was privatization, because it's more efficient use of the resource. And it promotes individual liberty and choice. But there's something called the anti-commons. And the tragedy of privatization is that the resource is prone to underuse because of exclusion. And where we're seeing this discussion is actually around technologies. The Rockefeller Foundation had a conference in connection with the organization that publishes Science Magazine, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. And they were really concerned about how drugs, HIV drugs that are being patented, or tests for environmental matters and public health matters, are being limited and underused because of patents. So what we have is the tragedy of privatization, and the anti-commons is underuse because of exclusion. The New York Times called it a new kind of apartheid, separating haves from have-nots. This is around privatization of water. So we've got a public water supply and infrastructure, and South Africa privatized it, even though it's identified as a human right in South Africa, and now people can't afford to buy water, so they're drinking water from polluted sources. I don't know how you evaluate efficiency in terms of child dying of diarrhea. The other thing about the anti-commons is that it forces problems back into the commons as unmanaged damage. It externalizes costs, and it can delay innovation in safer and cleaner technologies. So when we privatize publicly funded research, And you all know the story of Novartis and Berkeley. You all know the discussion around the country going on about what the right role is, especially since the Bayh-Dole Technology Transfer Act, a law that helped, that was really trying to increase our global economic competitiveness by using this vast and marvelous intellectual infrastructure of public universities. And we wanted to transfer the intellectual capital into the private sector so that we could capitalize on it. And so what we know is that doing that is focusing on global economic competitiveness. It avoids researching problems that are in the public domain and might implicate technology. So we have a don't ask, don't tell policy. So if it's going to make us richer, if it's going to get California out of its economic doldrums, then we better not ask if it's going to damage your children's brains or further pollute the waterways, right? Isn't that what we're going to do? We can't afford to ask that question because we need that new technology to drive our economic engine. And privatizing publicly funded research makes us pay twice. The New York Times did an incredibly interesting article on medical research and said, here we pay through NIH to develop these drugs. We move the technology into the private domain, and then you have to buy the glaucoma drug again. So we're paying not only for the research, but now we have to pay for all of the rights to use it. And we develop cures, but miss prevention, which is at the heart of the precautionary principle. So the public trust doctrine is one solution to the anti-commons problem. And you can read all those. That's little tiny words, and it's too long. And the only one I want to point out is there's a definable public interest in the health, beauty, and integrity of some resources. It gets at that California notion of what the public trust doctrine is all about. So the public trust doctrine is really a solution to the anti-commons problem. So how can we use public interest research for the Commonwealth? We can screen technologies before patent application for potential harm to the commons and to the public interest. We can define a public interest research agenda and fund it. You know, it's really fair for the universities to say, you're not funding us. If we're going to set the agenda, we have an obligation to fund it. We need to use the precautionary principle during research and ask the right questions, and then carry the precautionary principle through regulation and into the court system, as I said earlier. Public interest research in this framework would foster more open source biology, not privatizing it. In Iowa, when we were discussing the Democratic platform, one of the discussions was, why would we have a privatized computer code for voting machines? Why not have open source code for those voting machines? Why aren't we doing that? Why aren't we doing open source biology in all sorts of areas? In my part of the world in North Dakota, we've got a farmer seed breeding club. So the farmers and the scientists are working together to breed seeds for our ecological niche and keeping them in the public domain. My vision is that we will have the best library of seeds developed by farmers and scientists for our region in an open library. We need to foster more open source science. We need to encourage the use of nonprofits for holding patents. And Berkeley, you're doing the right thing. We have some wonderful examples of nonprofits doing public interest research and then holding the patents so that that can, and I'm blocking on Eva's last name. Harris, yeah, Eva Harris, yes, Eva Harris and her incredible work on dengue fever. And then we should not transfer technology to the private sector if the public has paid for it. Keep it as part of the Commonwealth. If we've already paid for that research, let's keep it in the public domain. So when we look at public interest and private interests, who decides what will be researched, who pays, who gets the benefit, and who takes on the threat of harm? President Kennedy said scientists alone can establish the objectives of their research. I don't agree with that, but it's an interesting one. But society, in extending support to science, must take account of its own needs. Have we done that? And then the last word. This comes right out of Poor Richard's Almanac. An ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. We can invent these solutions. We really can. Thank you.
Thank you. That was kind of breathtaking.
But
how fast it was.
Well, what I wanted to do is slalom through ideas. So you're not, I gave you a bunch of jigsaw puzzle pieces, right? And you're going to have to take them and fit them together. What I wanted to do is just this slalom through, and you'll know what to do with them. You'll know where to go. There's plenty written about all this stuff. You'll know where it fits your work and how to improvise on them. I just wanted to lay down that basic riff so that you could play.
Great. Well, we're going to do some questions, but maybe I'll find a place for you to sit.
I don't want to sit.
Oh, you want to stand?
Oh,
okay.
Don't you?
Yeah, oh, sure. We'll stand.
We're gonna. No, writers sit. Talkers stand.
You're right. I'll stand. One I just wanted to throw out here, there's something you said that struck me. You're talking about introducing ethics, and you mentioned in passing the one example where it seems to be happening, which is stem cell research and cloning. How is that not what you're talking about? I mean, that is a place where we're having a debate about a technology that many scientists are,
right.
Scandalized by, but it seems to me exactly what you're talking about.
It is. Yes. So is there? Wouldn't it be interesting to apply that to a whole lot of other things? Mm-hmm. Why do we just leave it to one?
And what's the mechanism? Is it more bioethics commissions? Like Cass Sunstein? Is it? I mean, what do you think the method is? Is that?
You mean Leon Cass?
Yeah, sorry.
Cass Sunstein writes about cost-benefit analysis. Right. We need less of that. No. I think it's what Wendell Berry suggested in Life is a Miracle. And he said that really the way that we would set a research agenda is the community gathered around and setting your agenda for your institution. And he said that if the mission of every university was the health of its community, what kinds of things would you undertake and look at? You'd be looking at asthma in San Francisco. You'd be looking at autism in California. You'd be looking at EMFs and supporting DHS's work. You'd be looking at the economic issues and how to develop those things. So it would be setting a research agenda for Berkeley. And coupled with that dialogue with the community, I think you get the ethical dimension built in. There are a lot of concerns that your community has around research using nuclear materials. There's been a huge debate out at Davis around chemical weapons research. There's been a huge debate. But where is the point of entree into the university except through the local community? And I think that that's the only level. I think another bioethics commission means that we don't get to participate, that we don't have the freedom to talk about values and ethics and the public good. We need ways of carrying on that discourse. So the journalists have a huge part to play in giving us permission and room and language for talking about ethics.
I'd like to ask the audience if they've got any questions they'd like to pose. Ignacio?
I might be excused to make a personal comment. When it was about my daughter giving up her pacifier, it's really difficult to imagine how that happens from age 2 to age 15. I know that at age 15 she was not going to carry a pacifier, but how she was going to give it up was a big, big, big question. I would ask you the same question about what you're proposing here, especially for a university. I really believe you're right. I really cannot imagine science doing anything else with what you're saying 100 years from now. But what do we do with what we have now? Is it only a cumulative set of examples, like Eva Harris doing this great work, for people in the health department doing great work? It seems to me like there is evidence that when you actually do something significant at the institutional level, you get hammered over the head.
Yeah.
So how do you have that transfer from situation A to situation B?
Well, I think that I'm going to tell an anecdote, and then I'm going to answer that. But this is a parable about that. My husband grew up on the farm, and he was born in the 1930s on our farm in North Dakota. No running water. Mom delivered him alone in February in North Dakota. And he had a bottle, and his dad really wanted him to quit using the bottle. So he said to Fred, who's this little kid, said, the pigs want to borrow your bottle. And Fred said, oh, okay. He said it in German. And so the dad took the bottle out to the pigs, and when he came back, Fred said, "Where's my bottle?" And Fred's dad said, "The pigs want to keep it." And Fred said, "Okay." So that's how one answer. So let's just turn it back over to the pigs. Yes, yes. Yeah. Like biblical stories and like Sufi tale. That's a Sufi tale for you. I really think that the way to do it is to begin looking at open source technology and publicly owned technology and transferring the revenue and the profits to the public domain so that there's a funding source out of it. So that the funding source is not going to private companies to do it. And I think through that, we've got to come up with the economic mechanisms by which the public benefits and profits from its own inventions, the ones that we funded. Is that, I don't know if that, you're nodding your head so that it looks like it's more satisfying than the pig answer.
Yes, during the course of research, of course, when you're in nanotechnology, is there a time which you can get the scientists to say, we got to look at this other aspect of this, and maybe we shouldn't go any further, but I don't know if any science department would ever even consider that. Go over to one of your physics department and tell them to do that.
Biotech did that.
Will you repeat the question?
I'm sorry. The question was, how can you actually stop scientists from doing stuff? And it's really a heated debate right now. Can we stop the Raelians from cloning offshore? Sort of like your offshore credit card, your offshore banking, and your offshore, cloning, all sort of in one lump sum. I think that's the question for society. Can we? Do we have a right to? Or do we have a liberal society that is essentially taking a libertarian view around science and technology? I think it's one for open discourse. My take on it is that if we invite scientists to this higher good, and if we begin to create disciplines and ideas for it, that we're going to always have rogue guys. We're going to have the rogue biotech guys who are inventing weird bacteria in their garages. I wrote a chapter in a book on when you're doing your biotech in your garage. It was the textbook for this, and wrote about the precautionary principle in it. You're always going to be that, but can we as a society dictate the kinds of things we want? We're seeing incredibly cool things going on in science. Green engineering, green chemistry. They're setting the parameters for it. We need to cross-pollinate the green chemistry folks with nanotech so that nanotech is not using cadmium, which we know all about reproductive toxicity with cadmium. Are we going to let them use that molecule in developing new things when we know what it does to human bodies? So we can direct it through these positive ideas. We can invent this whole green chemistry field. Wonderful stuff going on in that. Wonderful stuff going on in biomimicry. Cool things. And a lot of industries are taking the lead in driving those new technologies and those new innovations. So we need to do funding packages. We need to create visions for scientists to do more than get rich and sit at Berkeley and patent something and go through the Bayh-Dole Technology Transfer Act. I think the whole open source code has been the pioneer in the field. Cool stuff. I don't know, maybe that's not a word you use in California. It is one we use in Iowa.
Tom Leff with Health Building Network, and in the process of working on an industry guidance statement for green healthcare construction, which incorporated encouragement to move away from persistent ocular toxins and building materials, things like that. I mean, both the precautionary principle in that and some other aspects of the guidance statement. And during the public comment period, some industry people offered a suggestion that we incorporate precautionary references that I followed. I don't remember them right now, but you probably know them. They were talking about economic uncertainty and using the same language that you raised, and saying, now, they're doing things, putting constraints on things that might cause global warming, putting constraints on use of persistent toxins may cause economic damage. There's uncertainty that it might cause damage to the common good through economic problems, and so you should be no more acting on that than you should on health issues. Do you have a nice canned response to it?
Just like the old dirty chemistry that got us into the messes we're in, and green chemistry is a whole new approach to that. And just as the precautionary principle is changing the terms of the debate, so we need a new thinking in economics. And Richard Norgaard here at Berkeley is doing an incredible job. But what we need out of economics are three things. One is a cogent critique of cost-benefit analysis, because it's just like risk assessment right now. We don't know how to do anything else. We need a critique of cost-benefit analysis. Then we need something that is a whole new way of structuring our economic ideas. I think the public trust doctrine is the beginning, because it's an answer to privatization and efficiency. So it's a way of beginning to think of harm to whom and what. And the third thing is we need specific economic tools. And I think that we've got two. One is the performance bond, which a great economist came up with, so that if you're going to try some new technologies like nanotech or biotech, post a performance bond. I wrote about it as our technology casino. You want to gamble on your technology, don't make me pay your lost bet. So you get to pay.
How does it work? How would that work?
Well, so for instance, when Cali, PA wants to license a new technology, or California, you've got a patent going up from Berkeley, that at that point you post a performance bond, and it's held in an account, in an escrow account, and given so many years. Mining law does this. New law signed when the last days of Clinton. If you mine federal land, you are required to put up a performance bond, and then you get it back when the land has been reclaimed. So you're paying on your gamble. I don't want to pay. So it's one of the tools that we can use. The second one is, let's get rid of the low-cost bid. The low-cost bid builds in harm. You know about this in buildings, so you cut all the corners, right? But if the Italians don't do that, they get rid of the high-cost bid because they padded stuff, the low-cost bid because they've cut corners. They average the rest and take the middle because that's closer to the true cost. That's a precautionary economic tool. Now, I've just named two. What are the other 25 that we need to have in place? Where are the big ideas that are going to give economic vibrancy to San Francisco and to research in Berkeley and to whoever else as we're trying out these ideas? These need to go together. We can't do the precautionary principle and use the old, tired, bedraggled cost-benefit analysis, which is exactly what you were talking about. The second thing is, stand up, please. This is one of the true heroes in the environmental movement and the healthy business. For all of you student journalists, he's doing some of the cool stuff, the wonderful, I'm going to drop that word. I've got to think of a synonym. What's your synonym? Delicious,
tight.
Delightful.
My son says tight.
Tight. Such tight stuff. So if you want to look for a source about new and emerging things, talk to this guy, okay? Because they're doing wonderful things.
Why, will you just fill me in on why you can't reconcile cost-benefit analysis with precaution?
I think you can. But I think that because we automatically go to cost-benefit analysis for things that don't necessarily compute in terms of dollars and cents. I don't know how you think about a child's brain being damaged. So we calculate the cost of special education, and then maybe goes to prison, and so increase in prisons. And if you look at just look at the asocial, antisocial diseases of autism. We're creating a whole generation of kids who are banging their heads against the wall and who cannot get along with others. Now, one argument was that it's all those computer programmers that moved to Silicon Valley. But if it's not that, we're creating a whole generation of kids who can't function in society. Those are costs that you can't calculate on a dollar basis. Now, I did threaten to sue my parents because when I called them up and said, "Dad, I'm suing you." My dad was surgeon-in-chief of a large hospital, and I said, I could have been smart, but I ate mercury in my tuna every day for lunch, and you usually had leaded gasoline, and you had old junky cars, and I listed the other things that he'd done that I knew were neurotoxicants. and said, I'm suing you for the loss in my productive using cost-benefit analysis. And I have to say my father laughed. He did not, so how do you, I could have gone to Berkeley, but no, So how do you, cost-benefit analysis doesn't work for things that have no dollar costs. I heard an economist argue against the precautionary principle because it said we should leave all these problems to our children. We should not try and solve any of them because two things. One is that every generation for the last however many has gotten richer. And the second thing was they're so much smarter and will have so much more technology that they can solve it. So we should just not do anything. And this is an economist's answer. This is using cost-benefit analysis. Now, at some point, that just defies maternal sense. I don't know that that's. I don't have kids, but I had foster kids who were brain damaged, and so.
Okay, Mark. So I think one area where both the precautionary principle and the public trust doctrine is about to come into place in this whole business of open ocean ranching, which is taking fish farming from the 3-mile zone, moving it out into the EEZ, and putting it in the pelagic, underneath the wave action and stuff like that, and we're making really, really big farming. So the question in my mind about it is, it seems to me that the public trust doctrine is going to be an argument against doing that, or an argument against allowing the government to just privatize the pelagic zone. How would you argue, as you said, the public trust doctrine is largely a state doctrine. There are 48 different doctrines, but it must have been originally a federal doctrine because it was given to the states on entry into the Union. How would you argue that the public trust doctrine applies to the federal government, which is going to be the agency that's policing the pelagic?
Well, a couple ways. One is U.S. Fish and Wildlife are considered the trustees of wildlife. I spoke to U.S. Fish and Wildlife last year, and they really feel their trust responsibilities. And I think that the biggest argument is we're going to have to craft some really, really elegant economic arguments against privatization. And given this particular political climate, maybe not in California, but in the rest of the country, privatization is the way to go. You look at the World Bank, you look at all of the drivers towards privatization, and we have not had a cogent political and economic argument against privatization. And I think that it's, or do you disagree?
No.
Yeah, so I think it's going to have to come in a multifaceted way through journalists writing for the New York Times and Harper's, and to make these cases about it. And then we're going to have the smartest lawyers on the planet working on this. And I'm sure they'll all have graduated from Boalt Hall. So.
Yeah.
But by the way, I was part of the Lake Michigan lawsuit on Loyola, and we were looking at the public trust doctrine, so it was back in the 1980s and early 1990s, and we were looking for a way to back up that law so that Lake Michigan could not be privatized. Catholic school owned lakefront land, wanted to put a private sports utility building, whatever you call it. I don't know. I guess it's not sports utility, it's building. And the legislature sold it to them, 26 acres of lake bottom, and we sued. And I'm very proud of that. We won. We got that lake back from Loyola. Catholic University hasn't been inviting me to speak very often. So. But we're going to have to do that on a federal level and craft it around. We have an international, the Food and Agriculture Organization are the trustees of the seeds of the world, and they've been limiting privatization of the seeds through FAO. And then U.S. Fish and Wildlife are the trustees under some of the federal law. So we've got some federal trustee law in place. We're going to have to extrapolate from that.
Yes.
Hi, I'm part of a seminar where we're assessing different chemical policies, and the reason we're doing that is because the guy who's leading our seminar is chairing a UC Berkeley committee that's entrusted with envisioning a new chemical regulation policy for the state of California. And so within those discussions, the people have said, oh, we'd be
I'll tell you where the precautionary here's more hand-wringing. Industry wants to only use precautionary approach because it doesn't include shifting the burden of proof. So that means they don't have any responsibilities to test their product, to monitor for damage, and to pay for cleanup. Tell them to get over it. That's my opinion. The interesting thing about the language in the precautionary principle is it was translated out of a German word, which translates into English as precautionary principle, but does not translate back into the German word. And the literal German is forecaring. We don't even have an English word that that has that nuance and richness to it. And if the precautionary principle doesn't work for you, throw it out. Use what works. Just don't let them wiggle out of their responsibility. And make sure that you are free to talk about values. Make sure that you're free to talk about the public good. You don't have to use the words precaution. And, there's some ideas that it's a sissy word. And, those women won't let their kids climb up in an apple tree. And, I went to see a Jungian psychologist named James Hillman. Anybody know James Hillman's work? And Michael came to that meeting. My question was, what are the underlying archetypes that help undergird the precautionary principle and help make it real in this culture? And what's blocking it? And so as I've written about it in the public trust doctrine, that first of all, the left and the right hated government. The left hated it because it was limiting who you could sleep with and who you could marry and all this other stuff. And the right hated it because privatization was so much more efficient. But if you think about these words and use big and inviting words, sentinel, guardian, there's something heroic and visionary about this. So it's not, the left and the right going, ugh, government, which both have done. So we've sort of left it hanging. Okay, raise our taxes, Mr. Schwarzenegger, and see what happens to you. So we really need more language, and all the language we can possibly use. Precautionary principle doesn't work. Out the window. So you journalists, help us. We need your skill with language.
Why do you think these ideas have gained more traction or gained traction first in Europe?
Oh, they have a different culture.
We'll talk about that.
Yeah.
What? Sissies.
Bunch of sissies? How many languages do you speak, Ignacio? A little under 4 or 4? A little under 4. Europe just has a kind of a different philosophy. They've had to live closer together. They've been struggling with big environmental problems in small places. And so they've just got a philosophy about it. And the precautionary principle in Europe is not as well developed. Gauls, shifting the... they don't do all that. It's just a kind of an ethos. But because of our risk-taking cowboy culture, we have to have a different kind of approach. It's one of the reasons precaution, with the sissy sound, has been a little bit of a paradox and problematic, whereas it's not in Europe. And they look at us like, what are you spending so much time worrying about it for? But it's just built in.
Yeah, all the way in the back.
There is one country in Europe which actually is going the other direction, and it seems to have taken place in Chile and New Zealand for economic experiments from the Chicago boys. And that's actually Ireland, surprisingly enough.
Is what?
Ireland.
Yeah.
And so my day started very early this morning with a call from the deputy leader of the Labour Party in Ireland who gave a speech about e-voting. Now, our radical version of it was that not even the Commission entrusted with introducing e-voting was allowed to look at the code. So it was that radical version. I won't go into more about what actually happened. She was speaking in Parliament this evening. But we are also privatising our universities. So this is a more radical step than I think has even ever been thought of here, even in the worst periods. And I'm just interested in your advice on this. How do we actually fight this? The only thing I can think of doing is saying that the successful revolution in Ireland did have a strong socialist stroke communist streak in it, and that we actually are in some sense beholden to that revolution. would you actually agree with that line of thought, or is there an alternative? Because it is actually going to happen, and the struggle is going to get very ugly.
So what exactly is your question?
My question is, how do you think we should fight it, other than actually taking a very radical step of referring to a socialist ethos in successful war of independence?
I think it's going to have to also be, there's going to have to be trickster elements, there's going to have to be direct head-on protests, there's going to have to be hunger strikes. I mean, who's pioneered hunger strikes? Better than, there's going to have to be all ways. There are going to have to be new economic structures put in place. But until we say, this is ours, you can't have it. You cannot sell this off to the highest bidder. Until we have a political movement that says that. Not that you can't privatize everything. You know, you can't privatize. There's some things that I've got a farm. My husband and I have a farm. It's an interesting thing. But there are things that the public library, the universities, the water, the air, which cannot and should not be privatized. What are our kids going to do? Where are kids going to get an education in Ireland if everything's privatized? What we're going to do is we're going to have increase the haves and have-nots. That was the kind of apartheid that South Africa was talking about. And that's what's going to happen. And until we argue for education as a public good, and argue it philosophically as a matter of philosophy, as a matter of politics, as a matter of economics, as a matter... can I pound the table on that one?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay.
Keep it waiting. Yes. But Berkeley isn't what it used to be now. It's no longer a radical, free-thinking place.
I know. I mean, but you let me in to speak.
The city adopted the precautionary principle recently.
I was a consultant on that.
Very.
I was a consultant on that. We did the white paper, and I worked on that second by second.
It was very thoroughly and strongly fought against. And what ended up being adopted was a very small facsimile of the precautionary principle. It was also managed by economic development. Interesting marriage there. Another couple of interesting things about Berkeley, it has in its charter the lowest bid. It's a difficult thing to get over. So that's a radical change that council has to do to change that concept. And I do think that the precautionary principle is greatly feared, especially putting the onus on the manufacturers, to the extent that I think they will fight it tooth and nail. And that's the basic essence of the pathway, is the cost and prohibiting rapid development of new, incredibly powerful money generators like silicon industry or nanotechnology or whatever else. And to that extent, I think they are prepared to fight it in academia to stop the free movement. There is a tool to do that. HR 3077 is currently passed the House and been to the Senate and will afford a method of fighting free thinking in academia by government. I had one real question for you, and that's balancing the two concepts you provided us with. One is that risk assessment is evil, and secondly, that you want manufacturers to do their own risk assessment on products before they come out.
No. I didn't say risk assessments are evil. I think there's a place for risk assessment, for instance, in comparing alternatives. But as a basic philosophy that we're going to measure risk and then manage it, that's a different philosophy than preventing harm. And I'm advocating a change in a philosophy. Now, as a technique, when we want to compare two alternatives and know whether one's less harmful, then we need a tool like risk assessment. I'm not arguing that it's harmful at all.
Because I hear an awful lot of people. I mean, I think an average person listening to you might have come up with that. A lot of people do think. I mean, I sat in meetings, commissions, where people come up and said RA is evil, health services are evil, shouldn't consider it. But again, we have to use what is available, technology is available to us. And I think it's a useful tool, as you said.
Yeah, but not for everything. I was much more critical of cost-benefit analysis for things which are to, and there was a real interesting article in the New York Times Magazine section on cost-benefit analysis this week. If anybody wants to look at it, My colleagues Lisa Heinzerling and Frank Ackerman at Tufts, Lisa's in D.C., they were reflecting on their book called Pricing the Priceless. So now I'm harder on cost-benefit analysis than risk assessment.
There is one area in society or the economy where I think what you're describing, precautionary principle, applies, and that's pharmaceuticals. Yes? Is that a model of what you're talking about?
It is.
And why does it happen there and not elsewhere?
Yeah, it's an interesting model. It's not entirely successful. And one of the things about it, is that you do lots and lots and lots of testing on pharmaceuticals. But they have a backup program for monitoring. So one of the things we do advocate for the precautionary principle and the monitoring is that a doctor has an obligation to report adverse drug reactions. So that they've got ways of, thalidomide was actually stopped from being introduced as a drug that pregnant women could use by one woman at FDA. Just one woman said no. And the information she had was that the fingers and extremities tingled, and she said there's some evidence of a neurological problem. No, she didn't know anything about birth defects at that point, but she said no. So it was banned in the United States. We still have the big problem in Canada. But there are laws that you are required to report an adverse vaccine reaction. So you've got this follow-up monitoring system, and we have nothing like that. One of the things I've been advocating is that states and Center for Disease Control can set up systems for monitoring environmental health patterns. We just had a really interesting problem where a group of workers in a popcorn factory all needed lung transplants. And what they were getting was pulmonary obliterans, a disease that was just terribly destructive. A lawyer and a doctor figured it out. So this pattern emerged, and they figured it out. And it looks like it was the fake popcorn butter that was used. Where do we get that kind of observation? Interesting things going on in Minnesota. It looks like children conceived in the spring in rural areas in Minnesota have more birth defects. How do we deal with those kinds of patterns in a precautionary way? So we need to build in systems like FDA into environmental health matters so that we can observe emerging patterns, or USDA. What kinds of patterns can we observe around GMOs? And we've got a real interesting one now, pseudo-pregnancies in pigs with GMO corn. Fake pregnancies. You know how many farmers have either lost their farm or lost generations of piglets? A lot. They're not really pregnant, so this reproductive toxicant is getting into the food supply. This is true. Causes problems in pigs. Would you ever know if your miscarriage, if your abnormal pregnancy, if it was related to GMO corn? How would you know? How would you know? So we need to set up systems to monitor those kinds of early warnings and patterns, emerging patterns like FDA.
Yes.
Up until, I guess, the mid-'70s, seatbelts in cars were auctioned. You had to pay an extra $10 to have them installed. And I recall that the automobile manufacturers thought the installation of those belts was mandatory. Tooth and nail, it's going to add a couple of bucks to the cost of the car, and we felt all the sort of reasons that get trotted out by industry as to why something should happen. But we all know that there are probably some of us sitting in this room that are alive today because of seatbelts and airbags, another thing that industry thought pretty significantly. But back then, I think there was a sense in government that there were people that were concerned. What that, we as citizens or human beings that had some kind of concern about our well-being. You don't get that sense now. You get the sense that it's about jobs and economic growth, and we're willing to pay the price of some, additional cancers or whatever. It's just part of the cost.
Not in your agency.
No, well, and I'm wondering, Carolyn, if you see states, around that are taking a different approach. You hear about the Northeast, Maine, or New Hampshire, those states that are taking a different look at these kinds of things. That are taking a different approach.
A lot of piecemeal stuff going on. I want to just say that my observation is that the environmental landscape is changing. And the biggest change that I've seen in the years that I've been doing environmental work is that now we have government officials who really, really care and are going under the radar, who are doing what it takes At US EPA, there are incredible people who are defying the anti-environmental policies of that administration to protect health and the environment. It's really stunning to me. And so what I see is that in tight times, economically tight times, people are restricted, layoffs, harder to do good environmental work. And what we're seeing is more dedicated public officials. I think it's incredible. And so for all of you who are in government and all of you who are thinking about it, you're doing the work of the angels. So I don't see any systematic huge change anywhere. If any place is California, California EPA and some of the things your agency's doing. And so they're little incremental, a couple of people changing how an agency does things in little places.
Okay, we're going to get one more question from Ignacio, and then we're going to wrap up.
Can any of this happen, especially in research with Bayh-Dole? Since your answer should be no, how do we get out of it?
Could you say that again louder?
Bayh-Dole. The Bayh-Dole Act. Can we having the Bayh-Dole Act on books, I think is what it is out there.
Yeah. Well, that was me on CNN during the Iowa caucus saying to Mr. Gephardt, if he really wanted cheaper prescription drugs, he'd repeal Bayh-Dole. How many people are getting money through Bayh-Dole? How many of you have technology transfers in this room? Well, actually, Ignacio, I've got a scheme for repealing Bayh-Dole, but I don't know that I'm going to say it in public. I'll tell you later. But I think that there's some political things that are ripe right now.
Yeah, why don't you define it?
The Bayh-Dole Technology Transfer Act was passed by Evan Bayh, a Democratic senator from Indiana, and Bob Dole, the Republican senator. And it was a way of moving technology into the private sector. And so it did a number of different things, but it changed the structure of research funding and really incentivized privatization of research done at public institutions. Is that a fair summary? Do you want to add anything, Ignacio, to?
Just from the point of view of the researcher here in Berkeley, it opened the possibility of professor being an entrepreneur, basically. You get the chance of profiting from your discoveries, and therefore the incentive to do research on those discoveries and to find a partner that will buy your discoveries and so on.
The other.
Without being there.
So there aren't as many mechanisms for keeping the products and the profits of that research in the public domain. The other thing that happened was it set up research centers, which allowed the federal government to fund research. One of the most infamous of all the biotech seeds, the Terminator technology, which doesn't reproduce in a second generation, and there are variations on that, was developed at one of these through this Bayh-Dole Technology Transfer Act. So we paid for the research, and then the license was given to Delta and Pineland Company, which was at that time being bought by Monsanto. So instead of any of those, first of all, the public didn't want it, and second of all, then we paid it, and then we weren't getting the economic benefits from it. It was the exact opposite of everything that publicly funded research should be doing. So that's the problem. There are a whole bunch of pieces to it, but the whole goal was to privatize and get these technologies moved into the private sector to increase the wealth of the country.
I think we'll wrap it up right there. I want to thank Carolyn for her intellectual slalom, which was very vitalizing to listen to. And also thank you for matching the color of our poster with what you chose to wear today. I didn't send her a swatch, but she just somehow did it. But can we just have a hand of thanks for Carolyn?
Thank you. You have been so wonderful and such a delight. It was a lot of fun to speak with you, so thank you. I'll get my CD out of here.
Good idea.
I wanted to ask off camera, so to speak. I'm not sure what your position is on stem cell research, but you alluded in what it seemed to be a negative context to the bioethics review panels.
Oh, I didn't. I was simply saying that it's an example of ethics in research.
Okay.
No, I wasn't
sure what the
No.
was.
No.
Because
I didn't mean to